Good morning. Good morning. Let's get started. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of which we meet today, the ANAO people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us today. Thank you for coming, and just also be aware we have those joining us through the web stream, and we can also take questions through the web stream. My name is Bola Oyetunji. I head the Systems Assurance and Data Analytics group at ANAO. I joined ANAO about 2 years ago, and it's been a good experience, I must say. Just for the facilities and emergency procedures, so behind me here you have the toilets, and then next to it you have the emergency exit, but I hope we will not need to use that. So this is an opportunity to share thoughts and get feedback from CFOs and share our thoughts with what we're thinking about, for the coming year, and give some insights of what we're doing. So as I was preparing for this this morning, I was reminded of a book by two Harvard professors, Linda Hill and Kent Lineback, on leadership. And they noted that trust is the most important thing in a professional relationship, and of course, indeed, in any relationship. And they described trust as a competency, which tells me that, you can learn it and you can relearn it. And they wrote three elements in the trust competency. The first is technical competence. You know what you do. And then also that I know what I do. So it's not an expectation of you being an expert, but an expectation that if you need an expert for any complex areas, you can engage one. So first, in elements, they call it technical competence. The second they describe as operational competence, and that means you have appropriate governance and well-designed processes. So in our environment here, it's about having controls that are working effectively, and as auditors, that we have effective and efficient methodology with appropriate quality assurance overlay. So you must be technically competent, you must be operationally competent, and the third they described as political competence, which I interpreted as engagement, feedback process, continuous improvement. And that's exactly where we're here today. So we gather here to share ideas, to share the challenges that we face, and whether you know it or not, as auditors, we also share some of the pains you have to go through. But this is a time to then give us feedback so that we can have that continuous improvement. So today we're presenting to us will be Brandon Jarrett. Brandon is a Senior Executive Director in the Assurance Audit Services Group in ANAO, and he will be giving us an ANAO update. Claire Lewis, who is an Executive Director in the Assurance Audit Services Group, will talk about the key themes on the end-of-year report. Dr. Tom ANAO, a Group Executive Director in the Performance Audit Group, will give us insights in performance audit. And then just before 11, we'll have a short break. And after the break, Michael White, a Senior Executive Director in the Performance Audit Services Group, will talk about the ANAO pilot of audits of performance statements. And then he will also take the implementation of ANAO and Parliamentary Committee recommendations. So you can ask questions, after each of the sessions, during the tea break. If you don't want to, if you want to talk to any of us privately, you can also do that. So first up, please welcome to the stage, Brandon Jarrett.
Well, it's nice to see old friends and colleagues around the room, and whenever I'm coming to a presentation or even to work, I always have a look around to see what sort of metaphors that I can see, and today's highlighted by smoke everywhere. And I thought, what sort of metaphor can I use for today? And the best people came up with was smoke and mirrors, and I couldn't take that anywhere, not in this audience. And I thought, you know what? It sort of feels like a Saturday at Bunnings to me. And that's the sort of feeling I want to have with my colleagues here, open, engaging conversation like we're at Bunnings. Normally this presentation is given by Rona Meller, the Deputy Auditor General. She's needed today at the Joint Committee on Corporations and Financial Services hearing, which is looking at the regulation of auditing in Australia. That inquiry is looking at audit quality, regulation, market for corporate audits, conflicts of interest with the Big Four accounting firms, and the performance of regulators. The report's due in March 2020, and that inquiry follows a number of similar inquiries in the United Kingdom which have had significant impacts on the audit industry in those countries. There's quite a few submissions to that joint committee. On their website there are 94 submissions, of which the Auditor General has made number 45. That submission describes, the Auditor General submission, the legislation and other arrangements supporting independence of the Auditor General and the quality systems we have in place. We're seeing that as an important inquiry, not only because it impacts upon the audit industry, but also we engage a lot of firms to conduct work with us across the sector. We also have on today's agenda audits of performance statements. A few months ago, the Finance Minister wrote to the Auditor General requesting he conduct a program of pilot assurance statements on performance statements in consultation with the JCPAA. Michael will talk to our strategy, timelines and engagement with the JCPAA on this agenda today. We are currently planning for next year's performance audit work program, and we'll be reaching out to entities across the Commonwealth early in 2020. That's an important opportunity for people in this room and others across the Commonwealth to engage with us and to influence where you believe the Auditor General can look closely at the activities of the Australian Government and where benefit can come from our work. At this time of the year, the financial audit part of the office is busy preparing our end-of-year financial report. That report is tabled ahead of Christmas and in effect provides a summary of the financial audit activity results of all the work we do for the financial year. Broadly speaking, we've seen a dip in quality and timeliness in 2019 compared to 2018, and Claire will touch on that to the extent she can ahead of tabling in her presentation today. The pre-Christmas tabling is an opportune time for CFOs to slip off their shoes, drop an English breakfast into hot water and ask yourself 3 questions. Could these findings happen on my watch? What objective evidence do I have to answer question 1 confidently? And also importantly, is the Audit Committee looking at the right things with sufficient objectivity and insight? In other words, can they help me answer question 1? My colleague Claire will talk to that impending report shortly. The people in this room will be increasingly seeing the Audit Office asking for slabs of data that we've never asked before in both financial audit and performance audit. By way of example, on one financial audit this year, we've obtained all the pay runs for 3 years for analysis to be able to make an assessment on whether or not the HR costs in a financial audit context are appropriate. Bolo, who opened today's session, is playing a key role in leading this data analytics, and he'll be happy to talk to anyone in the break if there are questions about this and how we're going to manage that data. I'd also like to mention some senior staffing changes in the Audit Office. We have two. Andrew Pope, a Band 2 senior executive, has just returned from Jakarta after working with the Indonesian Audit Office, primarily in performance audit, but also in financial audit. We have staff placed in both PNG and Indonesia for a long time now, and he's played a key role in assisting their governance under an Australian aid program. And we've also promoted Lorena Skipper, a long-term employee, to a Band 1 position in financial audit. And finally, I wanted to mention accommodation changes. Some of you may be aware that the ANAO is moving to Sydney Avenue in Barton. The building at 19 National Circuit, which by the way has been the subject of 2 Royal Commissions and has its own Wikipedia page, was found to have some structural issues, but you can be confident the foundations of the ANAO remain sound. Thanks very much. I need to duck off quite quickly, and my colleagues will be happy to answer any questions that come during the break or later. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone. As Brandon said, my name's Claire Lewis. I'm an Executive Director in Financial Statement Audit, and I'm going to present to you on the results of our financial statement audits for this year, for 2018-19. These are summarised in our end-of-year report to Parliament. So the end-of-year report to Parliament is the second of 2 reports that we table annually. The first report was the interim report to Parliament, which tabled in June. That report summarises the results of our interim audits for 26 significant government entities with a focus on controls. This report summarises the results of our 248 mandated financial statement audits. It's a very large and detailed report. As Brandon mentioned, it's due to table mid-December. So this report tables after the CFS is released, and the CFS and its audit report was signed on the 16th of November. We're waiting to hear when that report will be released, and a week later we will then release the end-of-year report to Parliament. So some key highlights from the report. We have issued at this point 234 of our 248 auditors' reports, so 14 left to go, and that 234 includes the CFS. Last year we issued 241 audit reports in total. We have an indicator of quality, which is the timeliness of releasing audit reports. That fell this year from 90% in the previous year to 83%, though that percentage may again decline to 82% as we're finalising, doing our final QA over data from entities. You'll see there's a significant increase in audit findings, up by 25 from 159 to 184 in this year. And we also, as part of this report, form a conclusion on all the entities' internal control environments. And we concluded that key elements of internal control were operating effectively for the majority of entities to provide reasonable assurance that they are able to prepare financial statements free from material misstatement. Also in the report, we include additional analysis on a number of areas, and we've done this for a number of years. So obviously audit findings are a key part of the report. There's a large section dedicated to that, which I'll touch on in more detail. We included a section, or expanded the section this year, on the timeliness and quality of financial statements preparation. For a number of years, we've included analysis of the tabling of annual reports. Following the PGPA rule amendment this year, we've had a look at executive remuneration disclosures in annual reports. We've included an analysis on financial sustainability, which is again a piece we've done traditionally for a number of years. And we've had a bit of a dive into human resource service arrangements across the Commonwealth, so I'll give you an overview of what we noted from that. So audit report signing. So what the graph on the slide is showing you is our analysis of the timing of the signing of audit reports for 2018-19. So just to give you some context around this graph, we aim to sign our audit reports on the same day that the financial statements are signed, and at worst, 2 days after that date. So as you can see, there's been a reduction in the percentage of audit reports issued and obviously financial statements signed within 2 months of the year end. That percentage declined from 31% last year to 28% this year. And similarly, for financial statements and audit reports issued within 3 months of the end of the year, that's been a reduction, as we said on the first slide, from 90% to 83%. Audit findings. So the headline, of course, is that audit findings increased across all entities from 159 to 184. So this is audit findings in all categories. So I'm sure everyone in this room is aware we categorise our audit findings into A, B or C, so significant, moderate and minor. So while this increase, when you get the detail of the annual report, you'll be able to see this, primarily relates to minor findings, there has obviously been an increase in the significant and moderate findings too. I think it's worth noting that only the detail of the A and B findings appears in the end of year report. The C findings are only reported in total and by classification. So on that point of classification, you may recall we classify our findings for the purposes of the analysis in the report into a number of different groups: IT control environment, compliance and quality assurance frameworks, accounting and control of non-financial assets, revenue, receivables and cash management, human resource finance processes, purchases and payables, and then we have a catch-all, which is other audit findings. So I think it's pretty noteworthy that this year we have 3 significant findings as opposed to 1. So I'm just going to give you a little bit more detail on those. So one of the significant findings related to financial statements preparation. This is the only significant finding we've had in this category over the last 4 years. And this finding arose as a result of control weaknesses in contract and supplier management and financial reporting processes, which resulted in material adjustments being identified by the ANAO, and this highlighted, in our view, weaknesses in the integrity of the financial reporting process. The next significant audit finding related to quality assurance frameworks that support key processes and risk management. So this finding didn't have a direct impact on financial statements, but did relate to a key business process. And the third finding related to controls over asset management. So also on the slide, you'll see that 160 of the 184 findings were in the areas of IT controls, management of user access and privileged users, compliance and quality assurance frameworks, and management of non-financial assets. And consistent with the results of the interim report to Parliament, IT security remains the most common area of weakness, with almost 70% of findings in that area, in the IT control environment area. We also report legislative breaches in the end-of-year report to Parliament, and this year again we've had a jump in legislative breaches from 1 to 3. So these are L1 breaches, which are our significant legislative breaches. Getting a bit tongue-tied. So I'm just going to tell you briefly what a legislative breach is, a significant legislative breach. It's a breach of actual or potential breaches of the Constitution, instance of significant non-compliance with entities enabling legislation, and or legislation that is the entity is responsible for administering, and the PGPA Act. So the 3 significant legislative breaches related to: 1 related to a parent's entity's responsibility in fulfilling its obligations for reporting its subsidiaries as required by the financial framework. One related to deficiencies in entities' record keeping and governance arrangements, and one, which is an ongoing finding from 2012-13, relates to an entity's compliance with applicable legislation. Details of all those findings are in the end-of-year report. So as Brandon mentioned, timeliness and quality of financial statement preparation, we saw a bit of a dip in that this year, so the next few slides speak to that point. So in terms of quality, what we found this year was an increase in the number of financial statements preparation findings. We reported 1 significant, 4 moderate and 14 minor findings that related to processes supporting the preparation of financial statements. So compared to the last year, we only had 2 moderate and 8 minor. That's an increase of 9, so almost double. For a further 10 entities, we provided commentary in the end-of-year report, in the closing letter that's provided to management, indicating that there were opportunities to improve processes for financial reporting. We often do this if we feel that there may be some mitigating circumstances that don't warrant that to be actually raised as a C finding, or the matters aren't quite significant enough. But it should be a point for focus by management. Timeliness. So I'm sure you're all aware we agreed financial statement preparation timetables as part of our audit, and we monitored when the first draft of the financial statements was provided to us for audit compared to the agreed date. We noticed a decline in those timetables as well. 70% of entities provided their financial statements in accordance with the agreed timetable, as opposed to 82% in the previous year. A further 18% then delivered those statements within 1 week of the agreed timetable, and the final 12% on average gave the financial statements within 13 days. And the last point on that slide is about unadjusted audit differences. So the other element that's fed into our assessment of audit quality. So you'll note there's been an increase in unadjusted audit differences this year. So that's approximately 40 increased. I say approximately because the figures on the slide, there's a caveat around those. We're still updating that as we work through feedback from entities and perform our final QA over the figures. The other point to mention about the unadjusted and adjusted audit differences is that for the first time we've included a table in the end-of-year report in the portfolio entity chapter, which lists those adjusted and unadjusted differences by entity. So this graph is around our analysis of tabling of annual reports. This graph was in last year's end-of-year report for the first time. What it shows is the compliance with, there's a best practice in the RMG 135 for annual reports to be tabled before the Senate estimates hearing date and before the 31st of October. So what the graph shows is the Senate estimates date is at 0 in the middle there, and either side of that is when entities have tabled their annual report. So for example, 2 days before, at -2, 17% of entities tabled their annual reports. And then 2 days after Senate estimates, 4% of entities tabled at that point. At 0, 5% of entities tabled on their Senate estimates date. This has been a good result. So it shows that 71% of entities, so all those to the left of the 0, tabled prior to the Senate estimates hearing date, and 5% tabled on that date, and that's an improvement on the percentage timeframes from last year. We also noted that 4 material entities across 4 portfolios tabled after their Senate supplementary budget estimates hearing date, but that was also an improvement on last year. Another piece that we include in the end-of-year report is an analysis of financial sustainability. So in 1819, Finance established the Transparency Portal, and this allows information to be captured and tagged to compare and contrast financial information, financial results and mandatory annual reporting requirements across entities. The portal also facilitates the calculation of key financial ratios. So Finance has developed 4 ratios, And these first two on the screen, which are a measure of liquidity and gearing, the ANAO has used in its analysis of financial sustainability. The next two, the current ratio and the capital turnover ratio, we haven't used those, and they'll be available for use in the current year, in the coming year, 1920. So key points to note around our financial sustainability analysis. It's consistent with the analysis we've performed in prior years. We only analyse material entities, and to make the interpretation of the results meaningful in doing that analysis, we distinguish between for-profit entities and not-for-profit entities, between corporate Commonwealth companies, between corporate Commonwealth entities and corporate and Commonwealth companies. So the analysis of operating surplus is done based on an average over 5 years. We've provided commentary on the 44% of not-for-profit entities that achieved a large average surplus. We've provided commentary in the report on the 22% of for-profit and 13% of not-for-profit entities that also achieved large average deficits. We also analysed balance sheet strength using the gearing and liquidity ratios that have been provided by finance, and based on how those ratios play out, we classify balance sheets as strong, less strong or weak. And across government, we noted that 70% of entities had strong balance sheets. This is a deterioration in balance sheet strength. From the previous year in 17-18, that figure was 75%. And if you look at the graphs in the report, you'll see they support this. There's an analysis of the strength of balance sheets over 4 years, and you'll see there's been a move from strong to less strong, while the weak balance sheets have remained fairly stable at around 4%. Mentioned we looked at how the amendments to the PGPA rule around disclosure of executive remuneration in the annual report was done. So there's, as you all know, additional disclosure for key management personnel, senior executives and highly paid staff. So key to note with this piece is obviously the KMP figure is reported in the financial statements, so we audit the completeness and accuracy of that as part of our financial statement audit. But this year we also collected all the annual report disclosures, and we wanted to confirm their consistency with the KMP numbers reported in the financial statements, and also to assess, make an assessment if entities have observed the intent of those additional disclosures which are intended to promote transparency. What we noted was, we also noted a number of entities aren't required to report exec remuneration, and these are subsidiaries of corporate Commonwealth companies, corporate Commonwealth entities and Commonwealth companies, because they don't prepare annual reports. There's 4 entities where the KMP is an honorary capacity, so they don't have to provide these disclosures. And then the High Court of Australia and the Australian National University and its subsidiaries don't operate under the PGPA Act, so they're not required to do these disclosures either. So excluding the above, that meant there were 183 entities across the Commonwealth applying the exec reporting framework, and that included 16 Commonwealth companies and 167 Commonwealth entities. So what we observed from our review, what we noted was that there was some good practice. Some entities had included additional disclosures, either in their financial statements or by way of footnotes in the annual report to clarify those disclosures. We also noted a few variances between the KMP numbers in the annual report as opposed to that reported in the financial statements. These related to where entities had incorrectly excluded members in their annual report disclosure from the KMP numbers, but included them in the financial statements, so there's a discrepancy in who was included in each banding. We noted that some senior executives who were in the annual report disclosure were not actually included in the KMP disclosure by name, but had been included in the banding. And we also noted that entities had reassessed the number of KMP too. Some had assessed that they had less KMP, but not many. So most of those had done that, and a few entities had assessed that they had more KMP than the previous year. So the next two slides relate to our observations around human resource arrangements that exist between entities. So we've done this analysis because given the increase in entities receiving HR services from external entities and the impact of these on our audit approach, we thought it'd be useful to look at these arrangements, the structure of these arrangements and the governance that's supporting them. So these are two recommendations that came out of our performance audit on shared services, but we haven't just looked at the shared service arrangement, we've looked at all HR service arrangements across government. But we did it in the context of these two recommendations. So what we saw, what this slide's showing you, is that in total there are 62 entities receiving HR services from an external entity. Four of those provider entities are non-Commonwealth entities, and 9 of those providers are the entity's portfolio agency. I guess the overview of this, the conclusion from this is what we found was that Commonwealth service delivery hubs are more explicit and detailed in the agreements that they have set up with receiving entities. And our takeout from that is that a greater level of detail around governance arrangements is going to facilitate a better shared understanding between entities of how that arrangement is structured and the mutual obligations of both parties. And that should, more detail in the agreement should facilitate receiving entities obtaining sufficient management assurance over payroll transactions in their financial statements. The other point we noted is that one of the objectives of shared service arrangements is to establish efficiencies. And of the review we conducted, we only found 6 entities that had undertaken costings prior to entering into shared service arrangements. 3 of those had done an analysis pre and post the shared service arrangement. In the absence of benchmarking data, it's difficult for entities to determine whether what efficiencies have been gained from moving to shared service arrangements. So moving forward into 1819, obviously I'm sure it's come through that one of our key concerns arising from what we've observed in the 1819 audits is around the timeliness and quality of financial statements prep. We conducted an internal debrief on all the matters that had arisen during the audit cycle that seemed to contribute to this overarching theme of increased financial statement findings, increased adjustments, decreased timeliness. So on the slide, what I've put is a few of the strategies that we at the ANAO have put in place to help alleviate these matters and move forward to a better position. So we're agreeing in our audit strategy document this year, you'll see it coming through. What we've tried to do is agree the topics and timing of accounting position papers for those contentious or complex matters. This should help us reach early agreement on those issues to avoid delays in financial statement signings at the last minute. Part of that piece is noting that accounting position papers need to be based on the reporting framework, not on desired budget outcomes or other desired outcomes. In respect of key estimates, again, we want to make sure we've got mutual agreement about the timing of those that allows adequate time for us to review them and understand and challenge the assumptions that have been used by management, and also reminding management that it's their role to apply appropriate rigour and review over those key estimates. And then finally, just to collaboratively agree responsibilities and expectations and for the timings of things at deliverables, and especially in the final phase. So for example, an understanding that any changes to cleared financial statements after the audit's finished need to be communicated to the auditor. It's likely to delay signing if that doesn't happen. We need to be kept informed of intended signing dates, so don't change your signing date without telling us. And any other sort of changes of that nature. We just need to work really closely together to make sure we both understand our positions. So I'm happy to take any questions. That's the end of my presentation. In which case, I'll hand over to Tom Ianu, who's going to provide an update on performance audit. Thank you.
How many entities, agencies had no audit
That's a really good question, and I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I can. There were obviously a number, but from my recollection of the tables in the end of year report, you'd only be able to do that by elimination because we've only listed those with audit findings. More had audit. Sorry, did you say audit findings or audit adjustments? Findings, sorry, apologies. I actually don't have that number to hand. There's more that don't have than do have because, but that number is in the annual report, is in the end of year report, in the detail. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Claire. Good morning, all. Where's the... Okay. Good, that's the right one. So we thought it would be useful to alert you to our performance audit on implementation of the clear read principle which tabled on Wednesday. Is it?
Yeah.
That?
Yeah, try that.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Great. All right. So we thought it would be useful to alert you to our performance audit on implementation of the clear read principle which tabled on Wednesday. This was a cross-entity audit requested by the Parliament's Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit, the JCPAA, which has shown a real ongoing interest in implementation of the resource management and performance frameworks introduced as part of the PGPA Act reforms. So, just to recap, implementation of the PGPA Act was expected to improve both financial and non-financial performance information to allow judgments to be made regarding the public benefit generated by public expenditure. And I've just put on that slide the language to that effect used in the revised explanatory memorandum for the bill. And it used that language around achieving a clear line of sight between the information and key documents and establishing a clear read across those documents. In summary, the whole point is to improve the line of sight between what was intended and what was delivered. And people are familiar with the key publications in the performance framework. I won't step through those, but they're the documents we principally looked at in the audit. So, as I said, the JCPAA has taken a real interest in this across 3 audits, and you can see that it's basically looked into this pretty much every year since 2015 through those audits. And it's expressed an expectation, if you like, through that process about what a clear read means. So what does a clear read mean? What JCPAA did was it described a clear read or a clear line of sight as exhibiting 3 key characteristics. It relates to the presentation of performance information within one reporting cycle. So that's an entity's information within the one reporting cycle. Secondly, it relates to an entity's presentation of information across multiple reporting cycles. And third, it relates to the presentation of material between Commonwealth entities, and it's looking for some degree of comparability, consistency of reporting, the level of information provided, etc. And this applies, for example, in respect to joined up or linked activities. So they're the 3 things to think about within, across, and between. And if you like, it's not us sort of articulating it in this way. It's very much the JCPAA having reflected across those 3 reports and inquiries that it did and articulating out to to the sector what its expectations are as the Parliament's voice, if you like, in this space. So, in its third report, the committee recommended that we consider conducting an audit of one complete performance reporting cycle to establish whether a clear read had been established. This performance audit addressed that recommendation, and I've just put up the audit objective and criteria there. Nothing surprising there. Effectiveness of design, so we're looking principally at the Department of Finance there, and then effectiveness of implementation, and we're looking at the entity level there. The selected entities, as I said, were Defence, Health and Home Affairs. We principally focused on the 17-18 performance reporting cycle, which was the third reporting cycle under the current arrangements. So you'll recall that that one commenced with the publication of PBSs in May 17 and concluded with the tabling of annual reports in September, October of 18, about 18 months later. Now, we didn't just focus on 17-18. We also tried to establish in our review of the entity level work how they'd travelled over time. So we also looked at their reporting in 16-17, 17-18 and 18-19, and also their plans for 19-20. So it was a bit sort of more comprehensive than you might first think. We also looked at Finance's design activities right up to the 19-20 performance reporting cycle. And I won't go into this today, but we looked at whether Finance had implemented some of the recommendations made by JCPAA on the way through. So this is the other important slide, I think, in terms of informing you yourselves about how you might be travelling in this. How did we do it? Basically, to assess the extent to which the committee's expectations had been implemented by entities, we looked for A, whether there was clear information, and that was in the context of within the reporting cycle. Second, we looked around whether there was consistent information, and that was both within the reporting cycle and across the reporting cycles. Third, we looked for reconcilable information, and that was within the reporting cycle. And then we looked at whether there was comparable information, so that was across the reporting cycles and between entities. So they're the sort of dimensions that you might want to look at when you go home and have a bit of a think about how you might be travelling in this space. I've taken a bit of time to step through some of that methodological stuff, which is set out in the audit, because as interesting as the conclusions and outcomes are, you can read those and you can see how colleagues have travelled, but in terms of addressing your own circumstances, an environment where there's a fair bit of parliamentary interest in this, you might just want to have some regard to some of this methodological stuff. So, look, in summary, the Auditor General's overall conclusion was that Finance's design and the selected entity's implementation of the clear read had been partially effective, and parliamentary expectations have not been fully realised. Basically, the Auditor General reported that Finance had informed entities of the clear read principle, good, provided guidance on some aspects of achieving a clear read, but not all, and carried out monitoring and assessment of entities' implementation of framework requirements. Principally, Finance had focused on the clear read within the reporting cycle, and we thought that there was scope to expand its guidance to address implementation of clear read across the reporting cycles and between entities. And we made some recommendations basically directed to Finance to think about releasing some more guidance around those issues. Okay. In terms of the selected entities, so again, we've structured it in terms of the kind of methodology and expectations that I described a moment ago. So within the reporting cycle, we found some variability of outcomes, similarly across the reporting cycles and similarly between entities. The interesting thing about the between entities part of this was that the clear read was most evident in those areas where reporting was underpinned by framework requirements, in particular for the presentation of information entity PBSs and annual reports. And I suppose it shouldn't surprise you that where there's some clear guidance, people will pick it up and they'll run with it. Where guidance isn't as fulsome, maybe it's sending a signal out to people, or maybe people, aren't in a position to fully think it through. So hence the recommendations around the value, as we see it, of finance providing a bit more guidance to you folks. On the positive side, there was a lot that was positive, but another element of the positive side was that we did see entities demonstrating, at least each of the entities demonstrating one or more examples of better practice in this space. So that was good. Clearly there's some local thinking going on about how to make performance information meaningful and accessible to the end user, which is the Parliament and of course the community. As I said, we made 3 recommendations to Finance. 2 were agreed, 1 was noted. The first related to including some better practice examples of reporting that reflects joined up and linked programs and facilitates comparison between entities. The second recommendation goes to the Finance Secretary's direction, and as most of you would know, Finance is in the throes of sort of updating that direction and reviewing it. And they noted the recommendation because they felt that they weren't in a position to agree or disagree at this point because they were going through that process. And the third recommendation related to Finance's own internal review of portfolio budget statements, corporate plans and annual performance statements. And we suggested that there'd be value in Finance maintaining records of the advice that it provides to you after it does those reviews, and also Finance monitoring the impact of its advice and improving implementation of the framework by entities. There were also some key messages, 5 key messages. Basically the first message was, look, really a heads up. Remember to have regard to this. It's important. There's parliamentary interest around this. The second key message was we saw some real value in people internally coordinating the preparation of these key documents. You just get a better outcome if the teams preparing them internally, and they're not always the same teams, of course. At the very least, if the teams coordinate their activities. It helps achieve a more holistic approach to the preparation of the documents and, of course, facilitates and promotes this clear read idea. The third recommendation, the third insight was basically to remind people that the framework does allow you to update your corporate plan if your circumstances change, and I suppose we were a bit surprised that there had been some fairly large changes in circumstances for some entities and they hadn't updated the corporate plan. From memory, I think we created a Department of Home Affairs and during this period, and that corporate plan wasn't updated, which was interesting. So bear that in mind, because the principle you should always bear in mind is that given a corporate plan's a primary planning document, the Parliament, has a legitimate interest in seeing that being kept up to date. And there were two more sort of better practice ideas or insights there, which I don't need to go through too much. The report is available on our website, as all of them are. It tabled Wednesday, as I said. I think it's worth having a look at as people sort of grapple with this with this challenge of improving their performance information. And I'd be very happy to take any questions if you had them. Oh, well, we'll make morning tea on time then. Were there any questions from our viewers? No? Cool. All right. I will step down then. Thank you.
Yeah, we're almost there. Again, I think be prepared for if you have questions. We are ready to take the questions. I mean, the last question, was actually a good one. That's something that, again, the kind of feedback we want, and we'll be having the reporting team to really look through and think about it. So thanks for that question. So next speaker, or presenter. One presenter, two topics. Michael White, and as a Senior Executive Director of the Performance Audit Services branch. Michael.
Which button do I have to push?
This is the clicker, so that's for the slides. That's ready to go.
Cool, thank you. Good morning, everybody. This morning I'm going to talk briefly about the ANAO's pilot audit of annual performance statements, and then also briefly talk about our recent audit into the implementation of ANAO and parliamentary committee recommendations. One of the first things I should say in terms of the work that we're doing on performance statements is that it really did start a long time ago, and in preparing for this morning I went back and looked at the first reports that we did on this framework in my time. Back in 2011-12 we published work on the KPIs, which was part of the framework back then. We published two subsequent pieces of work which, funnily enough, are about piloting auditing on KPIs, and now a whole new framework along, and very little has actually changed within the frameworks. We're now looking to pilot audits of the annual performance statements. And I should also note that in preparation for this, and obviously it's been coming for a long time, the Auditor General has had the ANAO's performance statements audited for the last 2 years. The opinions on the ANAO's performance statements are published in our annual reports alongside our performance statements, and this is, I think, part of the model that we are or have been expecting to see come into play across the broader Commonwealth for quite some time. In more recent years, we've done three performance audits under ASA 3500 to prepare ourselves for a methodology, to prepare entities, and to test and work with the Department of Finance, who we work very closely with, to prepare for the possibility of the rollout of audits of the annual performance statements on an annual basis across the Commonwealth. The introduction of the PGP Act and rule was the beginning of the move away from what we termed KPIs back then, and moving towards talking about performance measures or performance criteria that come together within a structured set of statements like your annual financial statements and are published in entities' annual reports. The 3 performance audits we did have covered 10 entities, a range of entities there, and I'd have to say a range of results. The results of the audits were very varied. Some entities had been working quite clearly within the framework and the structure that has lasted for some decades within the Commonwealth now, without a great deal of change, although the names and reference points have changed somewhat. It's really been embedded around the developments of KPIs or performance criteria, flowing from the work in PBSs, now also the inclusion of corporate plans, all the way through to publishing results within annual reports. The new framework is, I think, a very strong framework. Publication publicly of performance statements does put entities on the map. It gives our Parliament the opportunity to look at what entities have done within the appropriation framework that we have within the Commonwealth, and it makes people accountable. So obviously from the ANAO's perspective, this is a very important part of our work. The Auditor-General's expectations were very high when we started our work on performance statements. He had expected that entities would have well and truly embedded the world of KPIs and the previous outcomes and outputs frameworks, and that we would see better practices across the board as we did our audits. Unfortunately, as I noted, the results have been very varied. We've continued to use performance audits on a yearly basis to continue to try and work with agencies, find better practices, develop methodology across the Commonwealth, as I noted, and to try and provide learnings to other entities who are within the Commonwealth and can learn from the experiences that are had by others in our audits. In each of our audits, and they're all available on our website, we have published what we would call our working papers. They're all available within each of the reports in the appendices. They detail each step of the audits that we go through, and we have been expecting that entities would pretty much use those as tear-outs to actually test their own frameworks as they do their own work. One of the key issues that we've had when we've worked with entities is constantly being told that it's a journey. It's not something that the Auditor-General has accepted. As I said, the current framework is vastly different to previous frameworks. It's been in place for a couple of decades. Entities have always been required to report on their outcomes and their outputs, and we did have an expectation of greater consistency and much better results across the Commonwealth when we started. The 3 performance audits have, though, noted improvement since 2015 when performance statements first became required. It's gradual improvement, and it's possibly not even across the board. The Auditor-General has also asked us within our performance audit group to include review of entities' performance information in each performance audit that we do that aligns to a program or allows itself to be audited across performance information in line with the scope of the audit. As you can see, there's 10 or a dozen or so entities there where we have looked at the performance information of the entity as we've done the performance audit, normally by another name. So overall, we've covered over 20 entities in the last 3 years. Again, the results have been varied, but there is now plenty of information out there for people to draw upon across a range of different types of entities, different size entities, different types of programs, and key learnings are included in the front of all of the performance audits. We will continue in this approach. Our performance audits will continue to look at performance information as we go, where entities' programs lend themselves to that type of work. Our focus in doing the work on performance statements is relatively straightforward, and we've been publishing our approach for a number of years. Firstly, we look at the legislative requirements in terms of performance statements and basically just complying with the PGP Act in terms of publishing them in a timely manner with the appropriate material included. We look at whether or not entities have got frameworks in place, and this is probably one of the key things for you as a group that is a significant difference from what we're used to seeing in the financial statements processes. Financial statements and regular auditing has seen very strong frameworks within the Commonwealth. Entities have very clear processes in place. They have very clear accountability, normally very strong governance over processes. We don't normally see exactly the same thing in performance statements, but we're expecting that to improve over time. We look at whether or not entities' performance information is appropriate. For the ANAO, that's whether or not the information is relevant, reliable and complete. We've been publishing our approach to this work since, I think, 2012-13. It aligns very clearly with the Department of Finance guidance in this area and is available in each one of our reports since our KPIs time, and there is additional explanation of what that all means within the reports. Finally, we look at whether or not the reported results are complete and accurate. This is something that most CFOs would just expect on a regular basis within financial statements, but it's been a significant issue for us within the performance statements. Entities don't have frameworks in place to ensure either completeness or, at times, the accuracy of everything within their performance statements. I should also note that we also look at the requirements for the audit committees to provide assurance to accountable authorities in this area, so almost in parallel with what we would do within financial statements, but the added hook that we do include the audit committees within the scope of our audits. The Department of Finance also has published a wealth of guidance in this area. As I noted, the criteria we use, relevant, reliable and complete, is included within the Department of Finance's RMG 134. There's a quick reference guide that's published at the back, but basically it pulls together the requirements across the framework to make it easier and, I suppose, to some extent, more digestible for entities. Key learnings that we have found to date through the performance statements audits. Initially, when we started working with entities, they were surprised that we were wanting to look at the corporate plans. Entities hadn't necessarily made the connection that corporate plans are the beginning of the performance process, and that the information in the corporate plans is the information that readers should be able to digest and set expectations, create an understanding of an entity's activities, and expect outcomes at year end, both from quantitative results from the delivery of outputs through to the qualitative results that have the impact on the population that we're endeavouring to address through policy matters and programs. Clearly describing what entities are intending to do has been a significant problem. The methods of assessment that entities will use at year end to determine whether or not they've been successful in achieving delivery of their outputs and outcomes has been something that we have worked hard with entities to improve, and that includes finding data, systems and frameworks that can underpin information at year end to give it the sort of completeness and accuracy we see when we talk about CFOs and general ledgers. We've also seen some reticence from entities to include targets or benchmarks. They take the appropriations, but they don't want to say how much they're going to achieve or when they're going to achieve it by. It makes it very difficult for a user of a corporate plan or a performance statement to understand what an entity was going to do when you don't know how much of it they intend to do or by when. These are things that we've been working with the Department of Finance on recently in terms of incorporating amendments to the PGPA rule and the Finance Secretary's direction. Achieving some greater clarity within those documents, I think, would assist all entities in completing their performance statements. One of the other things I think that is worthy of noting is that when we meet with entities to talk about their performance statements, we ask them why they're 115 pages. We ask them why they've got 80 performance measures. We ask them why they chose to put those elements within their annual report. And generally speaking, entities haven't had good rules of thumb to sit down in a planning process and say, this is what we would expect for our entity. This is what we would expect for an entity that does the types of programs we do. This is what we would expect for an entity of a similar nature to another. And that's something I suppose I'm not used to when I deal with entities within the Commonwealth, because entities traditionally are those regulators, those program delivery experts that we would go to learn those things from. And yet with the implementation of performance statements, entities haven't sat down and developed strong plans that make sense for the entity that they're in. Entities have typically looked for a lot of performance information rather than the key performance information that would be meaningful, not just within their entity, but also to the Parliament and the public. Entities have typically used very technical and complex language that's very difficult for them to even explain to us, which we find quite hard to understand. The origin of the performance statements is about providing information to the Parliament and the public in an understandable manner that can be digested and assist them in understanding how entities achieve their program delivery and their outcomes for the year. So simple language, good rules of thumb, benchmarks for what people are looking for, setting expectations early so that you know when you deliver something what that outcome should look like, are all things that we would expect entities to do on a regular basis, but something that we haven't found always in this work. As Tom noted earlier, the aims of the framework are actually a great deal more complex than the simple things that we've looked at in a yearly performance statement. Looking at results over time, looking at results across entities where entities are working together, areas where entities will need to improve over time if we're going to be doing audits in this space and providing opinions to entities each year. One of the real strengths of the PGPA Act framework for performance information is that entities are allowed to publish analysis to explain what happened during the year to their programs, what influences, what environmental factors, what things occurred that might impact what they intended to deliver during the year, and write that story down for the Parliament and the public. Good quality analysis is normally the sort of stuff that we all understand amongst ourselves as a group of officers within the Commonwealth. It's the kind of thing that you might think is just obvious but isn't necessarily available to external parties, and at a simple level explains what we did and why. This is an area that most entities could do more on. It's an area where most entities already have all of the information, and it's an area where all entities already understand what's happening, and it's more of a case of getting some of that down on paper to assist the users of the report than anything else. As I said, it's one of the key strengths of the framework. I think Tom mentioned another one. Within the digital world that we're living in these days, the Department of Finance has been very open to people republishing corporate plan information, amending corporate plan information on an ongoing basis. We've discussed it with them in some depth. They're comfortable with entities discussing with them how to approach doing that. They're willing to take calls from entities who say, we've been mobbed, we've got a different minister, we've got a change of direction, what do we do? It's pretty straightforward from Finance's perspective that we update corporate plans, republish them on websites and move forward without waiting to the year end and performance statements with a corporate plan that gives no real semblance to reality, to the results. So the pilot program, I think both Brandon and Tom might have mentioned this already. We've received a request from the Minister for Finance to undertake a program of audits of entities' performance statements. The Auditor-General has responded to the Finance Minister agreeing to undertake a pilot program of audits. Those pieces of correspondence have been made public on our website, so if you are interested in seeing them, they are available for everyone to see. The request from the Minister implements Recommendation 8 from the independent review of the PGPA Act. The review of the PGPA Act was pretty clear. Along with the JCPAA and the Auditor-General, there is a recommendation going forward that we do work in this space, possibly leading to the rollout of the auditing of entities' performance statements on an annual basis across the Commonwealth. While we know it's fairly early days in terms of formalising all these processes, we've been gearing up for quite some time. We will be applying the methodology that we've used for the last 3 years and the last 3 performance audits, slightly tweaked because we'll pick up ASA 3000 rather than 3500 for our work this time. We'll have some slight changes in the process. It'll look a little bit more like a financial statement audit than it will a performance audit. We would endeavour to start fairly soon to be able to provide secretaries or accountable authorities with the equivalent of an interim management letter sometime around the end of March to allow them to take any action that's necessary prior to the work at year end, which is what we would do in a standard financial statement audit. And then we are required to provide opinions to the Minister for Finance at year end. The Minister for Finance is required to table those opinions in the Parliament. Entities may choose to append them to their annual report with their performance statements, which, as I said earlier, the Auditor-General has already done for the ANAO, in line with where we expect this process will go. It is early days, and as I note, the process has a fair way to go, but by October next year we will be in position to issue opinions to entities. We are working through the planning process of this audit at the moment. We are working through the selection of entities for the audit. It's likely, in my view, to align to the work that we do in financial statements, and you're probably all aware of the controls report that's been talked about earlier today and the results from that. It's likely that we would use a similar collection of entities, which we have seen as the key entities within the Commonwealth, to select from for the performance statements work. They're also basically the portfolio bodies and other significant entities around the Commonwealth, and this is a process that we think would help lead performance statements auditing going forward. All of these things will be determined in the not too distant future. Obviously, I should also note that we will be working closely with the JCPAA, as the Finance Minister has asked us to work in consultation with them, which is what we would do normally anyway, and we do as a matter of course, given that they are basically our key committee in Parliament. We imagine that they will then need to determine their approach to oversight of this process. As a key committee, they will review any report that we table. They've also provided, as Tom noted earlier, a number of previous reports on the framework and its outcomes, and I imagine that they will have inquiries and possibly table reports on this element of it as well. Once we get through that process, we'll obviously be looking pretty closely at the collective responses. The Department of Finance will look to any guidance or amendments required once we've rolled out the new rule and guidance sometime early next year. We'll be looking at whether or not there's any need to amend our methodology and the work that we do in this area. We'll be looking at the commentary from JCPAA and other key elements within the Parliament. And we'll also be looking at the responses from entities who are included within the audit. Entities obviously are a key part of this process. We learn from the entities as we go. We will continue to develop all of our processes, and we will be pulling together a group of key representatives from all of those groups to work with over this time. That's pretty much where we're at right at the moment. Additional information will be included on our website as things progress. At this stage, as I noted, we've got to kick off some consultation with the JCPAA. We're continuing to work closely with the Department of Finance. They will be amending guidance and things like that as we go. And there will be, I suppose, other commentary and information available from other sources like the JCPAA as well. Are there any questions from people? No? All right. I should say in terms of performance statements, in terms of questions, anything at any time. If you've got questions, feel free to send them to us. Myself and my team present fairly regularly to audit committees. Pardon me. We do quite a bit of work with various entities around town in terms of their own work in performance statements and corporate plans. And we also work pretty closely with the rest of our performance auditors. So if you do have anything, feel free at any time. You can send questions in via AG1 at the ANAO or contact me directly. Email's available, and we can take it from there. Secondly, today, I'm going to talk briefly about recent report that we've done within the ANAO on the implementation of ANAO and Parliamentary Committee recommendations. Now, for the most of you, this doesn't include the work of the CFOs that's picked up within our financial statement processes on a yearly basis. So what we're talking about is performance audit recommendations, and generally speaking, we're talking about recommendations which have been agreed by entities as we work through our performance audit process. I should also note that there's more information available on our website. It's a subject of a recent insights by the Auditor General, and the report is also available on the web. Historically, we've done follow-up audits on ANAO recommendations. We do that either within audits that are within similar programs, or we actually do specifically targeted follow-up audits. The reason we do this is one of the key KPIs of the ANAO. Implementation of agreed recommendations is a pretty important part of our landscape, and it's obviously an important part there for our work. From last year and going forward, we will also be including parliamentary recommendations within the scope of work that we are doing. As part of our audit planning processes, we had at times received requests from parliamentarians and committees to look at specific recommendations from reports that they had done, and to look at including the outcomes within our work profile. So from now on, we will be including ANAO and parliamentary recommendations within our work. We aim to use both reasonable and limited assurance in this approach. It's an endeavour to achieve greater efficiencies in our performance audit work. So in terms of limited assurance, in a simple construct, as most of you will be used to, where there's strong and demonstrable governance and processes in place, and we can quickly work through that process, we would normally accept that the result of the process will turn out a good result. We would then move on to the next part of the audit without doing greater substantive procedures. In the current audit, we were able to do that for only one entity. Processes for the implementation of recommendations in most entities were not strong. They were not supported by frameworks that allowed us to use a limited assurance model. As a bit of background, the ANAO made 146 performance audit recommendations last year, of which 131 were agreed to. The JCPAA made 67 recommendations, and not sure that I can give you a current figure to how many were agreed to, given the slightly different process where reports are published before responses are received, but we do follow that up as part of our process. So this will be the first of a series of audits. The Auditor General's intention would be that we get to a limited assurance process with most entities, that we audit on a portfolio basis, and that we do 2 or 3 of these performance audits each year. That would give us the kind of quantum of results to assess whether or not our recommendations are being implemented as agreed across the Commonwealth for our annual reporting. The audit included 4 entities: Department of Agriculture, Air Services, APVMA and Infrastructure. We determined that a reasonable time frame for the implementation of an agreed recommendation was 2 years. There would be a concern about relevance if we lasted longer than that, we felt. We used a similar time frame for parliamentary recommendations, but it's a little more difficult to work through, given the complicating factor that the reports are published prior to responses being received, and some of those responses are received quite a time after the reports are published. The rationale for our work here is, I think, the key thing. ANAO reports and parliamentary reports identify risks to delivery of programs and areas where administrative improvements can be made. For entities to agree to that, then there's clearly something that needs to be done to fix it. Entities' arrangements to respond to parliamentary reports in the ANAO are pretty solid. We get our responses within our legislative timeframes at the ANAO almost all of the time. Parliamentary committees, unfortunately, don't get quite the same responses, and information is published in the report to show you that I think 80% of recommendations and reports hadn't been responded to for either the President of the Senate or the Speaker of the House when the audit work was done. There's also an expectation that once a response is published, that the commitment to the Parliament, we publish our reports in Parliament along with entities' responses to the recommendations that we make, are commitments to the Parliament, and that entities should undertake immediate action to start to implement the commitments that they are making. We're a little surprised to see that most entities that we worked with had frameworks in place that finished once a response was provided to either the ANAO or the Parliament. Additional action was not something that was part of what we saw in most entities. Overall, it was disappointing to see that none of the entities could actually demonstrate that they'd effectively implemented all of the recommendations they'd agreed to, whether they were ANAO recommendations or parliamentary recommendations. Agriculture was the only entity, as I noted earlier, where we could actually achieve a limited assurance piece of work, which meant that we were efficient. We looked at their framework, we were satisfied with the intended outcome, and we could move on. In each of the other entities, we had to do additional substantive work, which does take quite a bit of additional time and effort to actually work out whether or not the entities had done what they said they had done about implementing recommendations, either ours or those of the Parliament. In terms of key learnings, and I think some of these are pretty straightforward but not necessarily practiced across the Commonwealth, find out what the recommendation really means first. We had a lot of entities that had set sail on implementing actions that had nothing to do with what either the Parliament or the ANAO intended, which makes it hard to achieve the intended outcome. We also found that entities tended to typically agree because they felt, or that they said that they felt that they had to. There's no requirement for an entity to agree to a recommendation. But if the entity agrees that there's an issue, and that issue is something that is clearly demonstrated within the facts of the audit or the report, agreement follows logically. If entities don't believe that that's demonstrated, then we wouldn't imagine that they should agree. Implementing a recommendation that you really don't agree to is even harder than implementing the wrong plan. Entities need to work out the timeframes they can do these things on. They need to be able to advise when it will be able to be achieved by. It's very hard when you do a follow-up audit and the entity says clearly this was a 5-year time horizon and we've got a view that a reasonable time frame is within 2 years. I should note, implementation plans, which is the sort of thing that I was always used to seeing within the financial statement world, wasn't something that we saw in too many entities in this work. Agriculture, I should note, was one of the entities that did have implementation plans for recommendations of the ANAO. Those implementation plans were provided to the Audit Committee for review and through other governance processes, and closure packs, once recommendations had been implemented, also went through internal audit and their Audit Committee before they were closed. They assigned responsibility, they set timeframes, and they actually had performance information or success measures within those implementation plans and within their closure packs. Obviously, just having mentioned that for agriculture, it was clear that they were monitoring and tracking these processes on an ongoing basis. It made it very easy for us to look at the work they'd done, the governance processes they had, and achieve a limited assurance process in this work. Audit committees are an important part of governance frameworks for entities, both in performance statements but also in the area of implementing recommendations. It's the accountable authority's choice and the roles and responsibilities, and obviously there's a key governance committee available to look at this area. One of the other things that we found was quite interesting was that quite regularly parliamentary committees and the JCPAA ask entities to respond to them directly, to update them at a certain period of time. We found that entities typically didn't do that. So by the time we actually worked with entities, with the committee secretariats, there was already considerable pressure that was going to be applied to entities the day that secretariats had to issue follow-up notifications. I would have thought that it was a fairly standard approach. If a committee asks an entity to respond to them in a set time frame, to actually just do that, work with the committee and achieve a good outcome. That is pretty much the summary of where we've been with implementation of recommendations and where the ANAO is going in the future. Are there any questions on that report?
So you said that agriculture's system meant that you didn't need to do substantive testing. Is that because they actually went, you would see evidence they've actually gone down and they've checked to make sure that changes occurred? What would they do differently to everyone else?
Absolutely. Within the Department of Agriculture, we could, from the time of a committee hearing through to reporting and response generation, see all of the processes that launched into play. We could see all of the correspondence, communication and systems that were used to get to that point. And then from then on, we could just follow through their systems and through their committees, through their governance committees, through their records, that each individual step was undertaken as per their agreed policy approach. We could see that the implementation plans for recommendations would be delivered to the Audit Committee for endorsement. We could see that timeframes, accountability and everything was set within that and agreed at that point in time. And we could also see updates through audit committee processes and closure packs being provided with evidence to the audit committee at the end of the process after review and obviously endorsement by their internal audit. So it was a very straightforward process to walk through everything that they've got in their policy. If there are no other questions, I'll hand over to Bowler to close the morning.
Thank you very much. I think it's been a good 2 hours, and we'll see you in 6 months' time, where we will expect more questions and more interactive discussion. Thank you very much.